Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Reconnect with Plant Wisdom. It's me, Tigre Gardenia. I have to admit that I have kind of been sitting on this episode in the sense that I had a feeling I wanted to work on it. And I started to lay out my ideas and work on the outline. And then I sort of shelved it. And I think, honestly, this episode scares me a little. Mainly because it's hard to find the right words. But then this last Thursday, from when I'm recording it, we had our Naturally Conscious Leadership Group meeting, which is a group mentorship call that I do with my leader sprouts. These are all the people that have done or are actually are working with me as one-on-one mentorship and coaching, or have worked with me and then they're in Flourishing Sprouts in the Naturally Conscious community. And the Flourishing Sprouts is basically everything. And it's, peer mentorship call that we do once a month. And at the very end of that call, we got into a really great discussion about what actions you're not supposed to, bad word already. See, I already started off wrong. See why I was holding off on doing this episode? Kind of like, what is the direction that you want to take in the world in this particular moment? And how do you use what does it look like to be angry and to fight in a world where you don't want to create and perpetuate those types of energies? Now, I've spent years evolving past my old ways of expressing anger, back when criticism poured out of me unfiltered in everything I did felt like a battle. And if I hadn't changed, I knew that I wouldn't be able to build the types of relationships and projects and even, honestly, confidence that I have today, because I was leading with criticism that led to judgment that sounded like anger all the time. But in that process of, working through all of that and figuring out where all of that judgment was coming from and how was it that my criticism was unbalanced and leading to all these sort of angry ways of speaking, I actually swung too far the other way. I led with so much compassion that over the years, I have realized that I've let disrespect kind of enter into my life in a way that it was not expected. In other words, trying to always give everybody the benefit of the doubt, trying to look at ways to not, quote unquote, fight, trying not to step into anger. I realized that I walked away from things that I really cared about instead of fighting for them. And not because I didn't believe in them, but because I didn't want to be seen as irrational or difficult, something that was very common terminology used to talk about me in the time when my criticism, my dominant personality of being critical, of understanding criticality. I keep using that word and I'm still not sure. One day I'm going to go look it up to see if it actually exists as a word. But anyways, looking at my critical nature and leading from that, but with a sense in the background of myself of inequity and of not feeling good enough and of, the worthiness and imposter syndrome and all these pieces. So I had to work on all of that. But the thing is that there are some things that are worth fighting for. The question then becomes how, right? When is anger the right tool? And even if anger, is it really a tool that you use, or is anger more of a motivator? And when does compassion serve better? And this is really what I want to explore with you today, because this is going to be a bit of a more raw and probably vulnerable than usual. Not that everything I do is raw and vulnerable, but this is going to be even more, with probably, as I tell you all the time, a lot more fumbles of words and a lot of calling in my plant partners to help me kind of work through this, because this is really a topic that I think is very timely for everything that's happening in the world right now. So I want to first thank you for giving me the space to get into it and for being here with me. I'm looking forward to the comments and to all of, your own feedback on this and how you experience. So this is episode 106, Mastering the Fire Within, which is using using anger strategically. Using anger strategically. That really is. So that's the episode we're going to go into. And let's see what some of my plant friends have to say about this. Welcome to Reconnect with Plant Wisdom. I'm your host, Tigria Gardenia, nature-inspired mentor, certified life coach, and the founder of the Naturally Conscious community. For over a decade, I've been known as a world ambassador for plant advocacy, working closely with plants to share their practical wisdom to help you consciously embody the elements of life that nourish your evolution. In this podcast, I delve into ancient and modern knowledge from biology to spirituality about the wondrous ways of plants. Together, we'll explore how ecosystem thinking helps you overcome limiting beliefs, understand the true nature of relationships, and live an authentic, impactful life. Okay, at its core, this episode really explores how to channel anger and I expect quite expansive set of justice that I have. Let me try to explain that a little bit better. So, in this episode, I really want to get into the ways that I have been able to move and evolve my anger into something that's productive rather than being destructive or suppressed, and how I'm working on that suppression piece of it to kind of give it back into a balance that feels right for me, and how is it that it gets used, and how I walk many of my clients who also have many of these types of feelings through this. So this is really about a personal journey with anger and criticism, looking at the past and also what shifted, and then the realizations that compassion alone isn't actually always as effective. Where we want to think everything is beautiful and kumbaya, and there are ways to get to that, but it's not really always the best thing to lead from, even if that's the behavior. Also, I want to talk about the challenge of finding balance. Or better said, you know how I talk about this, it's about flow. I can't really think about it in balance, because when I put it into balance, that means that I sacrifice one for the other. Rather than flow allows me to move from, anger into compassion, and from compassion to anger. So really, I want to explore with you the impact of suppressing my anger and letting people walk all over you or walk all over me, avoiding confrontation at all costs, and how that's really not the solution either. So it's how do we recognize when justice and self-protection are actually needed? And then I want to talk about lessons from aggressive plants. I mean, there are some plants out there like kudzu and dandelion and mistletoe that are really quite aggressive, or parasites, or predators. Venus flytraps are predators. Like all these types of plants, they use their traits for the ecosystem. In other words, they create a harmony within the ecosystem by using these aggressive traits of themselves. And so, yes, they can easily go out of control. And we have seen that, right? We see when a species becomes invasive or goes too far out, which is very similar to my behavior when I used to be a very angry, or what's the right word? What's the word that I would use, that people always use? Presumptuous. I'm a very presumptuous person. That was the way that I used to be, very presumptuous. So I also want to talk about some of the tools that we as humans use in relation to the plants, because I think that'll help us get a different point of view. Like fire, for example, indigenous wisdom has used control burns to maintain an ecosystem health. And I think that if we think of ourselves in that vein, right, what is our human element and our component to work on in relation to the ecosystem, and how do I keep the ecosystem healthy? Fire is a very legitimate tool that we as an overall society have somewhat forgotten how to use. We either burn everything down, or we suppress it to the point where things get dangerous. So I think that that's a really good comparison. And then the last piece I want to talk about is how to develop your strategic and your purposeful anger, like when to fight for a cause versus when to walk away, and how do you start to build up your own checks and balances in this, and what is the difference between, for example, being reactive or being intentional, and how is it that you can learn how to be more surgical in using that anger. So by the end of this episode, I really want you to feel like you can give yourself much more space to use the anger as a tool rather than as a reaction, to recognize that anger, for example, when it's used with intention, right, can be a force for protection, for justice, and even for positive change. Now, I don't necessarily think that anger I guess maybe I misspoken a second ago, which is it's not really a tool. I think it is the fuel, kind of like we were talking about fire, right? Fire is the tool, but it's not a, fire is a tool that you use, but the intention behind it changes it. And I think that anger can be an intention setter in some ways when used constructively, but it's not the way to approach the situation. And I think this is something that I learned through this process. I really want you to see that compassion and strength are not opposites, right? They're being forceful and being compassionate are not on two ends of a spectrum. They really can work together, and that knowing when to walk away and when to stay your ground, right? When to stand up for yourself are really skills worth developing. That fighting for what matters doesn't mean neither losing yourself nor being actually angry, which I think is very different from using anger. It means showing up with clarity and purpose, and oftentimes with joy and fun. And that's really what I want to get into more than anything. This isn't about being angry all the time. It's about knowing when to pull up that fire and when to direct that fire in a certain direction, and then to choose consciously which of the various tools in your toolbox to use in order to let that fire burn. So let's really explore how we're going to use this anger wisely. But first, I want to invite you to connect with one of my eco-conscious business partners, one that is, in my opinion, very pertinent to this entire episode. The first time I connected with a plant and actually received a response, I got chills. It's such an invigorating sensation when you make a breakthrough like that and realize just how connected we are and that we are nature. As a nature-inspired mentor myself, I was super excited to stumble upon the Shift Network and its mission to empower a global network of evolutionary change agents. Talk about my kind of movement. There are so many inspiring thought leaders, healers, empaths, and other visionaries all under one roof, each one on an individual and collective mission to help you reawaken and co-create a just and prosperous world. Check out the show notes and click on the link to learn more about the Shift Network. Consider enrolling in a course or two. Their programs are the perfect complement to your evolving, naturally conscious life. All right, so let me tell you a little bit more about my own personal journey with anger and criticism, because I think that that's really gonna set the stage, let's just say. So you have to understand that I have always had a very, very, very sharp eye for details. While others maybe saw the big picture, I actually didn't start seeing the big picture until I was later in my life, probably in my 40s, that I started to see big picture items. I always noticed the cracks, the flaws, the inefficiencies, the things that needed to be fixing. In other words, my dominant personality is about being critical. I thought that, in my opinion, at that time, I thought that by pointing all of these little nitpicky type of things, or what I saw wrong with a situation, was going to be helpful. Like, I thought really that was the way I was going to help you. I was helping you if I saw a project that you were working on and here was a flaw or here was a hole. As a matter of fact, when I started my software career, like working in high tech and such, I actually started as a tester, and I was a very, very, very good tester. To this day, whenever I have something that breaks and I have to contact, support of any sort, I always have to warn them. I'm like, hey, by the way, I'm an ex techie with QA or quality assurance experience, because I'm very detailed. I give you every single step. How did I break it? Where does it break? I usually can find the corner cases and understand like when this happens and when that doesn't happen. The problem was that, being also very insecure, suffering from I'm not worthy and suffering from imposter syndrome so many of the times, when I would try to point things out, my words would tumble out with a force that honestly I didn't even realize I was doing. I wasn't just offering like a critique or pointing things out. I was tearing things down. Like, I was pointing out how your flaw was going to tank the entire system. So I wasn't surgical at all. I was more like, here's everything that's wrong and this is going horrible. At the time, this was coupled with the fact of I always feel this deep, deep, deep sense of injustice. Like, if I see injustice in the world, um, I just can't handle it. It's something that's still to this day very, very difficult. I feel it in my bones. It's something that hurts me deeply. If I see something that's wrong, whether in a personal interaction or a larger societal issue, for example, I react intensely. And back then, I didn't hold back because I thought that that was what it meant to be a good person. In other words, the way I overcame my unworthiness was to make my voice heard. And since I have a lot of energy, yeah, that voice was really strong. The problem is that when your anger and your criticism isn't strategic, it's not really calculated, it just comes out in this blunt, oftentimes very sweeping and broad way, then it's really overwhelming for the people that are receiving it. They don't know where it's coming from. They usually feel it like a personal attack. They also, it's so broad and you sweep everything into the conversation that in the end they kind of don't even know what you're talking about, because now it sounds like you're talking how everything is a disaster. And it would leave me really frustrated, and I felt very misunderstood. I was surrounded by people who were stuck in complaining cycles, because that's what I would attract, right? Because since my way of experiencing thing was to be like a sweeping this sucks, I attracted a lot of people who just thought everything sucks. So we didn't really create change. I would just, of course, good that I had a job for a long time that allowed me to do this. But when I moved into, for example, project management and release management in particular, it became a huge problem because I didn't know how to encourage somebody to say, hey, I see that there's a problem with this, but don't worry about it. We can work on it together. Today, I have a whole different language to be able to do that. So realizing that this approach wasn't working, I tried something different. I softened, right? I chose to really go down the path of compassion over confrontation. The other day, I was asked in one of our NCC calls to specifically talk about why the use of the color black. And because I use black, as in clothing in particular, very strategically. For me, from a Kabbalistic perspective, it's connected to Bina, which is the great mother of understanding. And that was my beacon. Like, I wanted to understand things, not in a let me dissect it, but more of, if I understand where you're coming from, then I don't judge you and I don't think you did something wrong. I just see a mistake that we could easily fix together. So by moving in this way, I tried to assume the best in people, giving endless benefit of the doubt, because I did not trust my own ability to sort of detect when somebody was being malicious or anything like that. So I thought if I just met others with kindness, they would rise to it. And if I let go of the anger and I focused on this understanding, people would naturally be inspired to do better. Yeah, that doesn't, by the way, that doesn't always work either, because it still sort of has this, it, let's just say that there are some people that are very highly motivated by kindness because they are misunderstood, or maybe they didn't understand the situation, or maybe you just have two different points of views. And so if you approach them with kindness, then, and you say, hey, can you just explain your point of view, then you understand where they're coming from, and then you can find the right way. The problem is there are some people who do not want to meet you. And so while this was overall a good shift, it helped me build relationships that I could have never had before. It allowed me to see the world through a more patient and forgiving lens. I was no longer repelling people with really sharp words, and I learned how to create a space for growth instead of tearing everything apart. Unless sometimes I was put into a group of people who were tearing everything apart. And I have to say that my tendency, that critical nature of me can really rise very quickly. But I hit another different wall, which is the fact that compassion isn't always enough. Some people don't respond to kindness. Oftentimes, I have learned, this is my own, I don't want to call it judgment because it's more of a discernment, because judgment has this bad word, although it is judgment in the sense of, I've realized that there are some people that even when you're kind to them, they can't respond to that in the sense of also taking steps to change. What they do is they just use it and kind of like use that, I don't want to say against you, but they use that against you. So while there are many situations that demand patience, there are some things in life, in friendships, in work, in society, that actually need to be dealt with in a much more forceful way. Because what was happening and what sometimes still happens is that I find myself letting people cross boundaries. I excuse behavior that I shouldn't really excuse, which is somebody maybe being very disrespectful for me. Now, I can understand because I understand their situation. I maybe know their traumas. I maybe know their fears and their anxieties. So I understand where their disrespect is coming from. And I can see, because I also see myself in them, that they can't always control it. But the problem is that if people would have only been nice to me in the time that I was going through this, maybe I wouldn't have dealt with it, because I only started to really deal with it and realize that I could deal with it when my world started to crumble, when I was losing friends, when I was finding myself very alone, when I was having difficulties at work, when I tried to go for a promotion and they wouldn't give me the promotion, even though they admitted I was the right person for the job because I had the technical skills, but I didn't have the personality to be able to interact with that team of people in the way that I was. So there are people who need, pardon me for saying this, a swift kick in the ass. And so, I also, in stepping away, what would happen is that when I would be super kind and compassionate, and then that situation in front of me wouldn't change, that person or that team that I was on or that project that I was working on would just continue to do the same thing, knowing that I would be the one to bend, give, and compromise, and they didn't have to do anything. I started to walk away from it because I wasn't going to fight anymore, because that just wasn't the person. I didn't believe that I had the power to fight in a way that was efficient and that would be seen as constructive. And I also didn't want to fight in a way that was just purely disruptive and destructive, which was my past. So I'd walk away, and I watched so many of the projects that I cared for and that they just crumbled because not pushing back when I should have, they'd had no impetus to push themselves out of their own comfort zones and move forward. I really avoided so much conflict because I was worried that I would be seen as irrational or harsh. I started walking away and started standing my ground, not because I didn't care, but because I wasn't sure how to fight anymore without becoming my old self. So I had swung completely into the other direction. And this affected not just, my work, it affected, my personal relationships, because, you get into situations where you look like this giant pushover, or you just walk away and you let it all fall to the ground. And I realized that I was missing out on things. That's when I really, really realized that my anger and criticism and even aggression are not inherently bad, right? Like, just like I've been learning about that relating to my dominant personality of being critical, also my anger is like that. These are incredibly powerful tools that, when used with purpose, can be very, very strategic. The key is knowing when to use them and, very importantly, how to wield them without causing unnecessary destruction, but very much being okay and leaning into the necessary destruction. And that's really what I want to explore more here. Now, I can't tell you that I have all the answers, because I still don't, right? I'm still very cautious, although I'm getting better at being kind of like breathing into it, trusting deep down that I have the best intentions, because that was another thing that changed. I had to make sure that I wasn't lashing out also, but that I was doing it from a place of love and kindness and compassion to myself also. And then therefore, when I would be able to take a very strong stand, I could be seen from that place of, oh my goodness, she really loves this. And that's really what I want to go to. So when I started holding back my anger, I thought I was choosing peace. But over time, what I realized was that I was choosing silence. I let things slide that really shouldn't have. I stayed in situations where I should have spoken up. I let people cross lines that you should never let them cross, because I convinced myself that understanding and patience was the higher path. It's the whole take the higher road. But the higher road means, sure, you don't succumb to the low tactics that these other people do, especially when you're dealing with, for example, narcissists, which not statistically, scientifically speaking, narcissists can't control themselves. So for you to just think, oh, I'm going to be compassionate to that narcissist, there comes a point where that doesn't work, because a narcissist has an inherent set of fears that govern their lives. And therefore, they are going to continue to bully and push in that direction. It's something they can't control. So you cannot try to just meet them with kindness. You can definitely meet them with kindness and understanding when they have that rare break that allows them to kind of be a little bit more vulnerable. You can create that safe space so that that vulnerability happens more often. But you also have to learn to see when that they're not in that space and block and sometimes push back quite harsh on their attack, because otherwise they feel emboldened and can continue to push and will not try to make themselves better. What I was doing was avoiding confrontation. Not because I lacked conviction. Trust me, in the privacy of my own home, I very much had a lot of conviction, but because I was afraid of being perceived as too much. You know, the famous too much that many of us, especially multi-passionates and people who are extremely passionate like myself, that hold too much, too aggressive, too difficult, too emotional. And the more I held back, the more I noticed the pattern that instead of resolving the issues, I was actually just tolerating them. If anything, I was supporting them. I was allowing these issues to move on. I noticed this in some of my most of my work relationships, I'll be really honest, in that period where I went too far, I would just walk away from them. And I can't even tell you how many projects I saw just kind of like, because I'm a driving energy force, right? I'm a catalyst and I'm a bridge, and I'm really, really good at creating that fire and holding that fire and being super passionate to get something done. And so when I left, some of these projects just fizzled. And I'm super sad about that. And in relationships, I saw these people I would just sit there and hold space for them endlessly. So I would be exhausted, and these people would feel great around me and not even realize that I was the one that was holding that space, and I was constantly compromising. And little by little, everything that I wanted and everything that I am would disappear. Luckily, I had done a lot of good work for myself to be able to know that me as an individual, as who I am and what I love about myself and all these things, they weren't breaking me down anymore. That was something that had happened in the past as well. But it still didn't mean I was getting what I wanted. And I definitely wasn't getting any kind of respect. I wasn't creating space for real growth. I was just enabling cycles that needed to be broken over and over again. So for a long time, this anger and this compassion, I was seeing these kind of as two opposing forces, right? Two ends of the spectrum. And I was trying to balance them. And you know what I think about stability, right? It's impossible, because if you stabilize everything, nothing grows. And that is what had happened. I had stabilized myself over into the world of compassion, and I had not given any space to my strength and my anger and all this. And so I leaned so much into this because I was afraid to lose control of the other. And that was that overcorrection, right? My language softened, my ability to understand and compassion grew. My mother has always said that I have an inordinate amount of compassion. And so I just leaned in it. But the thing is that you have to learn how to move between these two. You have to learn how to step into that anger and to step into that fire. Suppressing anger didn't actually make me more peaceful. It made me more hesitant. It made me unable to act when I needed to. And in a world like the world we live in, with a very aggressive species, which is us, Homo sapiens, hesitation can be really, really dangerous. So at some point, I started to ask myself, when is anger actually the right response? Because obviously anger exists, right? And if in an ecosystem something exists, it's useful at some point, right? That's the whole point of an ecosystem. Ecosystems don't have garbage. So everything that exists is useful to someone or something at some time. So when is anger useful to me? Well, obviously, anger and force is useful for self-protection, right? If I am being attacked, there is a way to use anger. I can't just always shield. Sometimes you have to push back. It's can be necessary when you're protecting others, right? Something is happening, somebody is being attacked, and I need to step into that and protect because I have the strength to do it and the other person might not, or the other situation might not. This could be, again, whether we're talking about a person or a project or a business or anything. And it's especially necessary when shared values, things that we really care about, are being ignored or trampled. So that helped me recognize and step deeper into the fact that, wait a minute, in an ecosystem, every species has its periods of attack or protection, and also of, all right, you take what you need because I don't care. And so I had to learn to do that. We see this in nature all the time. There's a difference between a plant that bends with the wind and a plant that has strong enough roots to stand firm when it needs to, right? You have some that build up really strong trunks so that the wind doesn't bend them at all. And others instead that have this flexibility and they do this dance with the wind. Some plants release chemicals to warn others of dangers. Some will even fight for their space in the ecosystem, not out of an aggression or for just the ability to be an aggressor, but because survival is based on the fact that they need this space. They need that light. And so therefore, they are going to make space for it. So the real question isn't, should I get angry? It's when is anger the tool that serves the highest good? And let me be really clear, because this was the piece that came up in NCLG, in the Naturally Conscious Leadership Group, that it took us a while and some working through it. And this is why I love this group of Sprout leaders, which, are so inspirational, because we have the ability in that group, in this space, in this safe space, in this mentorship circle that we've created, to really work deep inside of this. We were trying to understand the difference between, using not giving in to anger as an all-encompassing emotion, when not to fight, which just creates more destruction for the sake of destruction, versus when does it become spiritual bypassing, or when does it become the I'm not going to get involved type of thing, and then in the end, nobody is safe. And we were saying how, look, we live in the world of form, which means that there's duality. So you can't think everything is going to be like unity and kumbaya. But it doesn't mean that my fight back has to be with disrespect or with meanness or with judgment. My fighting back could be with joy, with love, with deep respect. When I love something so much that I'm willing to put my life on the line for it. When I believe in something and I want to protect it. When I want to joyously share with you in the temples of humankind in Damanhur, when you come into the Hall of Earth, beautiful, beautiful hall, which has, kind of almost the cycle of humanity, there is a big scene painted on the walls that is this giant battle. It's the battle of us as Damanhurians, as humans, battling against the enemy, which are these sort of gray creatures that do not evolve. And the way that we battle in this scene, which is kind of the tenet of the way Damanhurians do battle, is by laughter, by playing, by having fun, by moving mountains in joyous celebration. So when I'm talking about anger as an emotion, I am talking about using anger as your catalyst, as your spark, because plants don't hesitate to take what they need. They don't apologize for growing towards the sun or taking up space in the ecosystem. Some plants even spread so rapidly that when the conditions demand it, that you struggle to slow them down. They flow with what's necessary in the moment, and that's the kind of mastery I want. It's the ability to know when to lean into the spark of anger, not out of habit, but out of wisdom, and to pull on the tools that are not I'm cutting you down because you're shit and you're not worth it and you're horrible, but more of, I am going to do my battle by playing and laughing and, putting up and telling you that this isn't the way, this is the way that we're going to do this. And we are going to join in a celebration with it. Sometimes anger is the right response, not just for self-protection, but for protecting others, for standing up to what matters, for ensuring that shared values aren't trampled. And you want to do that with force, but that force should not be out of the idea of humiliating or destroying somebody that is not really involved. It should be about an ideal, a value, and looking at transforming that into a force for good. There are moments when the world does not need patience. It needs fire. It needs people willing to step up and say, this is not acceptable. And I want to be able to trust myself to know when is that moment. So instead of resisting anger or fearing I'm going to overuse it, I've been working on developing that anger. I've been working on developing the ability to step fully and step out of it fully when the time is right. I don't want to hold on to anger any longer than necessary. I want to kind of fill into that righteous indignation, those values. And I also want to be able to check my values. And I think that that's also the thing. When you're not in the grips of anger as things are happening, even if you're using that anger, you can always still double check what's going on. Like, is this still in line with my values? You don't go beyond what is necessary because I don't want to bypass when it is the appropriate response. I want to trust myself to flow between those states. I want to there's one of the organisms here in Damanhur, one of the main bodies is called the game of life. And the game of life really has one main goal: change. It is a body that has been created to instill and to create moments of change so that stagnation doesn't get a part of us, constantly shifting us into instability in order for us to grow. And then the other piece of it that I think most people forget about the game of life is that the game of life can launch a bomb into something in order to make that thing blow up because it's been too stable, it's no longer growing, it's stagnant, and it needs to move. But then the game of life has to come in and help put together the pieces again. It has to be able to make sure that it creates an environment where new things can grow and take root. And that's how I want to use anger. I want to be able to pull and call on that fire to like burn what needs to move. But then I also want to be able to be there to lend a helping hand to replant or to encourage new growth to come out. I want to trust myself to flow in these states, knowing that both of them have their place, both serve a purpose, and neither diminishes the other. That's the mastery I'm looking for. Not getting stuck in anger, but also not avoiding it, not choosing compassion always over anger, but learning to wield them both with intention. So to do this, because humans tend to be a bit aggressive, so it's really easy for us to kind of go into one direction. I had to start to ask myself, when is it that aggression serves the ecosystem? Because, like I said, nature doesn't really apologize for being aggressive when needed. Kudzu, for example, or dandelions and mistletoe are often labeled as invasive or parasitic plants, but their existence actually serves a really important purpose, right? Kudzu, for example, stabilizes damaged landscapes, right? Preventing erosion where other plants struggle to take root. And dandelions, for example, can really break up compacted soil. They can make way for new growth, besides the fact that the dandelion is an amazing plant with all kinds of different properties that can be used by humans, but that also grows in harmony with humanity and is ever present, right? They're ever present plants can want to be there to help and can do so many things. And so even though they are highly um how is it? They're highly successful at growing in places, and this can be seen as a nuisance. So some people might say it's too much. But the truth of the matter is that the benefits that they bring to the area by their presence and what they do to the environment far outweigh what it is that might be bothersome because there's too many of them. The same goes for mistletoe, right? Mistletoe is a parasitic plant. Mistletoe provides food and shelter for countless species. The mistletoe basically weaves key self into the fabric of a given ecosystem. These plants don't hesitate to expand, right? They take up space. They do what they want to do. They must survive and they must support the system that's around them. And I think that's the big difference. I think that when you apply anger unchecked, you end up just destroying something. I once had somebody in one of the nucleos, right? One of the shared homes that we live in here in Damanhur. I used to live in a home that at the time was fairly big. I think there was like close to 30 of us. There was 20 something of us in that house. I think 28 or something like that. And one of the people was saying to me that whenever I was upset, she was afraid of being in the living room when I would walk through the door because I would walk in and my energy was I was so upset that it felt like a sonic boom was coming through and just tearing everybody down. And everybody felt like shit afterwards. And I realized that that is that anger unchecked, right? When that type of strength gets unchecked, that's where it goes. As opposed to when you use it, that righteous indignation, when you set up those flames, you can be very poignant in when you use it and nobody else around you. My mother, when I was growing up, was a master of this. I remember one time she was telling off the disciplinarian of my school who was being an irrational jerk. Seriously, being an irrational jerk. My mother was being a saint. She had the patience of a saint back then. And I remember sitting down on a chair. Now, I knew what was happening because obviously my mother had been called into the school and the man wanted to complain about me. It's a long, long story. But one day, if you want, I'll tell you. Anyway, so I was sitting there in the chair and I was staring at my mother and this man talking. And if it wasn't for the fact that I didn't know what was going on, you would have never known that my mother was chewing this man out. Like this man, my mother put this grown man in his place. She explained very politely, very strategically why everything he was saying was categorically false and how his assumptions were more disruptive to the environment, which in this case was a school. He was new to the school and we had been in the school already. I had been in the school for like 8 years at this point. And my mother had already had my two brothers graduate from the school. So like my mother knew the school well. We knew the owner of the school. I had always grown up like in the office of the school. Like this was a place that was home. And this man and my mother made it very clear to him that he was wrong, that he was lying in order to make his point, and that my mother would not put up with him treating neither her nor me that way. But if you didn't know what was happening, if you were just sitting near them, you would have never known that my mother was chewing this man out because she was so polite about it. She was so strategically focused on him that nobody else in the room heard her. Nobody else in the room felt any of her wrath. Nobody else knew how angry and how much this man, you could feel him like shutting down because he was caught and he could not argue his way out of this because my mother was adamant and clear. And it was beautiful. So this is, I think, what we're talking about. We need to learn how to be strategic in the way that we use this, not to dominate the landscape forever, but to surge forward when the conditions demand for it, then retreat when the balance shifts. And don't force yourself out of the situation. Don't try to be submissive for fear of being too much. This man did not like my mother. He did not. And after the year after, he didn't like me either. But synchronically, everything worked out. I ended up leaving the school the next year in part because of this man. But it turned out to be the best thing I could have done because I ended up into a much better school with a better, like, gifted programs and all kinds of different, honors programs that I just didn't have in the school that we were originally in. So in the end, my mother's strategic work ended up creating a place where, sure, the man had it in for me because my mother told him off, but he ended up looking like the idiot because nobody could understand why he had it in for me because nobody ever saw my mother say one cross word to him. Nobody saw my mother treat him badly, and my mother didn't have to do anything else. So it turned out to be awesome to be like, this is one of those episodes of human behavior that I try to like tie into. But this is what we see with the plants, right? Strategic, do the thing that I need to do, flow with what it is, and help keep the rest of the environment healthy, even while you're destroying that one piece that is causing the damage. And this is the journey that I want for myself. I'm really right now calling deeply into those three plants to help me. Two of the three I can find growing around me because mistletoe and dandelion are found here. With spring right now kind of coming into full swing, there's this fantastic ritual we do here at Domenher where you get to connect with dandelions. And so I have in mind a little adaptation that I want to do to this ritual specifically to help me with this. Plus, I love having an excuse to sit in a big field of dandelions, asking a bunch of questions to kin and lying down there to receive. I mean, kin are awesome for this type of work. So if you've never sat down and had a conversation with a dandelion, please do. I'm also experimenting with some watercolors recently. That's another great way to help me connect. It's almost as if the sort of flowiness of the watercolors allows dandelion to share with me things that are a little bit more emotional of nature, probably that water connection of some sort that helps it do it. I haven't really seen kudzu around here and kind of hoping I don't, given some of the things I have heard about it. So I'm going to need to get a little creative. But according to the Smithsonian Magazine, I don't know if you know this, but this is one of those strange things. In 1930, what is it? 1930, I want to say seven, but I think it's 35. As dust storms were damaging prairies, Congress in the United States declared war on soil erosion, and they actually enlisted kudzu as a primary weapon. So talk about using kudzu's like aggressive tendencies for good. More than 70 million kudzu seedlings, not ceilings, seedlings were grown in nurseries by the newly created Soil Conservation Service. And to overcome this like suspicion that farmers had as to whether or not kudzu can actually be controlled in this way, the service actually offered as much as $8. Remember, we're talking about 1935, okay? $8 per acre to anyone that was willing to plant the vine. And eventually, to be honest, kudzu did go a little bit out of control. It has a really bad reputation as a terror, mainly because farmers couldn't figure out how to make money with key. They thought that they were going to be planting this and making tons and tons and tons of money. But the truth of the matter is that kudzu was very strategic. Soil erosion, take care of this, go out as far as you want. I'm not something for you to be making money off of. And so, of course, got a super bad reputation. In fact, kudzu has appeared larger than life in many of these ways because it's most aggressive when it's planted along things like roads and the rail line embankments and things like that, because these habitats become front and center of the kind of way that when cars started to come in, they had all this kudzu in the way. And so they got a really bad reputation. Anyway, it's all those types of things. But the truth of the matter is that kudzu was very strategic and really helped the overall soil situation. It rarely penetrates into any kind of forest. So the biggest problem that it had was the fact that as more land was getting cleared, kudzu was like, yay, more space for me. Let me head off over there. So in reality, if we would have kept more of our forests, we wouldn't have a kudzu problem in the United States. But that's another story for another day. And I really want anger to kind of be that way. I want my anger to have like the places where it is most appropriate for it to come out. And I want it to fear certain types of environments. Like I don't want narcissists to come and like push me around anymore. I want them to actually be like, no, that one is going to be respected. I had a friend of mine, a new friend, somebody that I like started to hang out with, but apparently he knew several people that knew me. And I made a comment about something once and he's like, oh yeah, they warned me about you. Like I just looked at him. I was like, what do you mean? He's like, no. It's a good thing. But they're like, they just told me not to fuck with you in this thing. I was like, I like that. I like that very much. Do not screw with me when it comes to certain things. And I want to be more like kudzu in that way. I want to have the areas in which I'm like, oh, you're going to push my button. You're going to try to railroad me. Then I am going to step all over this situation. I'm going to make it right. Not I'm going to push you down, but I'm going to make it right. And this is kind of that idea of fire as a tool, right? Fire is often seen as destructive, but in indigenous land stewards, like they used fire for ages, right? They knew it was a necessity. Controlled burns clear off deadwood and prevent very catastrophic wildfires. At the time, it was a co creation between plants and humans to use fire in this strategic way, to create fertile grounds that could be used for regeneration. So, because without them, the ecosystem became stagnant. And when fire would come, then because it would spark accidentally, which, you can get ticked off accidentally, and when that would happen, it would be uncontrolled and devastating. And that's exactly what I don't want. I don't want to bottle it up to let my environment become so filled with fuel that when something does push me too far, I just go off. I don't want that. This is the role of anger that can be very unnecessarily destructive. It's when you leave things unchecked. This is when everything gets burned in path without any kind of, guardrails on it. But when you wield this type of fire with wisdom, right, it clears the way for transformation. It clears the way for an evolution. Suppressing it entirely really just doesn't work. I mean, come on. When has that ever led to peace? Anybody who's ever been with anybody who's extremely aggressive or who's ever had a boss that's super aggressive knows that being a yes man doesn't make the person nicer to you. It just delays the inevitable. At some point, they're going to yell at you for no reason. It builds up this pressure until things explode because it's inevitable that it is going to explode. So true mastery is learning when to let the fire burn and when to let it rest, and to do all of these things with the intention of creating something better. I've seen, living in Europe for so many years and especially traveling a lot to France. France is very, very big on protesting, right? The French will protest anything. And it's an amazing social cultural tool that they've learned how to use. And I've seen so many instances where this especially in smaller communities. Like I remember I was reading once about wine, and they were talking about certain protests that the winemakers in certain regions would have. But they did it from the perspective of pushing out something that they thought was destructive, but then enhancing the thing that they thought was very good for the community, and therefore creating an enriched wine section altogether. And I think that that's the way protests should be used. I can't just think I'm going to go stand up there with a sign, or I'm going to create some space and I'm going to try to stop something. I have to then support the new thing that needs to come into it. And so this is where humans can actually be, agents for very strategic disruption, because we often hesitate to be the force of disruption, fearing that we're going to be too harsh or too demanding or too much in general. But nature shows us that destruction is really a necessary thing. Just like, again, plants spread where they're needed and fire resets an ecosystem, we too have a role to play in shaking things up for the better. The key really is flow, knowing when to push forward and when to step back, when to burn and when to rebuild, when to stand firm and when to soften. This isn't about fighting just for the sake of fighting. It's not about your ego. Put that ego aside, right? It's about consciousness and awareness and knowing how to use this as a tool. It's about mastery, just like nature does. So not every battle, to be honest, is worth fighting, right? Not every cause needs your energy in the middle of it. I've had plenty of things that I've walked away from and actually been happier about. I walked away from a certain big project that I was working with, even here in Damanhur several years ago, but I ended up getting a master's. I got more, I got my coaching certification. I moved into a deeper relationship with plants, and now entering back into, being responsible for Damanhur International, working a lot with our initiates around the world, I am much more equipped to create these fantastic relationships, to present the music of the plants and other projects that I am a part of. And I do it with a much more mastery that allows me to grow. Plus, it gave time for Damanhur to mature certain parts of what was happening here in the community. So it was a win-win. That was one of those times when walking away was the smartest thing I did. So some plants really are always looking for when is the right time for them to emerge. For example, you have plants like fireweed that emerges after the destruction. So not everybody creates the destruction. Some of them emerge afterwards. And so knowing your place, like, are you somebody who is going to do best if you come in this way or another way? Should you be the one to break that down, or should you support others that break that down because you're going to come in afterwards and help rebuild? Like, there's lots of little considerations to do, but if you take the time for these considerations, then that is the strategic use of that righteous indignation and of that anger. So anger works in that way, knowing when to stand your ground, when to make your voice heard, or when to instead, let something pass you by because it's not that important. The smartest choice is a choice that's made consciously, whether that is, standing up to an injustice, or whether that's stepping back and conserving your energy and waiting for a more effective way to create that change. Walking away isn't always defeat. It can be very, very, very strategic. And that's really the difference between an uncontrolled wildfire and a very calculated and careful managed burn. One destroys everything and the other clears space for renewal. And this is a very important distinction. Reactive anger is just a big, giant wildfire. It flares up instinctively, often leaving destruction. It even burns down things you never wanted to burn down. Intentional anger is different. It's a tool. It's wielded with precision and purpose and mastery. It doesn't consume. It transforms, and it makes space for evolution. So developing that mastery over anger means moving beyond reaction and into strategy. It's about pausing before lashing out, assessing whether this moment requires fire or something completely different. It's the difference between setting boundaries with clarity and burning bridges unnecessarily. Mistletoe, for example, doesn't really spread Key's energy everywhere. Key finds the right host at the right moment, usually a tree high up, and takes only what Key needs to survive. Because being a parasite means that because that plant is high up, if mistletoe takes too much, the entire tree dies. But mistletoe not only doesn't deplete the tree, but it keeps the tree kind of in check. Key integrates into the tree and creates a symbiotic relationship that sustains both mistletoe and the overall ecosystem, but by not allowing that tree to get too big, to take up too space, to hold others back. And this is how really anger should function for you, not as a blunt force weapon, but as a surgical tool. Used wisely, it can be a force for growth, for connection, and necessary change. This challenge that I'm giving you, which is the challenge I'm taking on myself, is not to suppress anger or to let it take over, but it's about mastering the flow, knowing when to ignite the fire and when to let embers cool. And mastery really means wielding anger with the same intelligence as nature uses every single day, purposely, precisely, and always, 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 never forget this part, in service to something that's greater. So I want to leave you with a few questions that I ponder myself to try to understand how to work closely with nature. The first one is, when is anger the right tool for action? This is something that you should ask yourself continuously. When is compassion the better response? Kind of looking and seeing how it feels in your body, asking your plant partners, taking a walk and being in nature and allowing the response to also come if you don't feel like you can judge it clearly. And how do we learn from nature, especially from aggressive, invasive, and parasitic plants, right? To use our emotions more effectively. And this is something that's great for you to work on, like to journal on, to spend some time in with a very specific plant, asking this question. Like, how can you, especially if it's an aggressive, like a dandelion or something, or a parasitic plant, how is it that you use your skills, even those that destroy, and how can those help shape my own emotions so that I can be much more effective? Because mastering the fire within is like I said over and over again, not about suppressing anger or forcing balance. It's about flowing between strength and softness and knowing when to blaze forward and when to just let things be, because sometimes you just got to walk away. So learn from the plants how to disrupt, how to regenerate, and how to restore, how to harness our own emotions for growth rather than just simply disruption, but not being afraid to destroy when it's necessary. So take some time to really reflect on how you're using and how you're working with anger in your own life. Is it serving you? Is it guiding you towards the change that you want to create? And let's keep this conversation going. I want you to reach out to me with share your thoughts. Like, remember, hit the like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell if you're on YouTube, but also leave a comment. And if you're in a place like a podcast app that doesn't allow you to leave any kind of comments, come into the Naturally Conscious community. Naturallyconsciouscommunity.com, super easy to find. And let's have this conversation. We're not meant to navigate our emotions alone. The plants know this, right? Kin don't suppress their own nature. They grow, adapt, and use unique traits to support the ecosystem around them. And we can do the same. But we need to be sharing in order to be able to do that. We need to experiment. We need safe places where we can play this. So if you're feeling the pull to really engage with your emotions differently, to stop either fighting or suppressing your anger and instead mastering your flow, then you don't have to figure this out alone. And you don't have to worry about whether or not you're going to destroy something as you practice. Come into the Naturally Conscious community. This isn't just a place for us to talk about plant wisdom theoretically. It's where you learn how to apply it. So your emotions become these tools that you can grow with. They're not your obstacles. And if you're looking for deeper guidance, I'm here to help you. As a nature-inspired mentor and a life coach, I love working with people like you, those who want to channel their emotions with purpose rather than being controlled with them. And the plants already show us how. So together we can help you integrate their wisdom into your own life. So if this resonates with you, don't wait. Join us in the Naturally Conscious community or book a call with me today. All the information that you need is, of course, in the show notes, because the power that you're looking for is already within you. You just need to learn how to wield it. So thank you for being a part of this journey and this conversation. And thank you for being here all the way to the end of this episode. Remember to resist the urge to hold back your emerging green brilliance. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Reconnect with Plant Wisdom. To continue these conversations, join us in the Naturally Conscious community, your premier online ecosystem for plant reawakening and accelerated evolution and co-creation with other kin. Here, you'll find expansive discussions, interactive courses, live events, and supportive group programs like the Plant Wisdom Book Club and the Sprouts Writing and Creativity Group. Connect with like-minded individuals collaborating with plants to integrate these insights into life. Intro and outro music by Steve Shuley and Poinsettia from The Singing Life of Plants. That's it for me, Tigria Gardenia, and my plant collaborators. Until next time, remember, resist the urge to hold back your emerging green brilliance. I'm out. Bye.